welcome to HNOC. I'm Amanda McFillin, I'm the Director of Audience Engagement. So excited to have all of y'all here tonight to hear from our speakers this evening. We'll be introducing them in just a second. So I think all of y'all hopefully have had a chance to walk through our exhibit, Making It Home. If not, you'll have a little bit of time afterwards. This is an exhibition that's meant so much to us here at the collection. It's been years in the making. It has been such a community effort, and we've had a great response from people all around New Orleans to this. It is open until October 6th. It closes in just about a month, so please spread the word to folks who haven't seen it yet. We'd love for them to be able to see it, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. Tonight we are partnered here for our Ce Soir with One Book, One New Orleans, which is an organization that we love working with. We've been working with them for a while now, different programming and book distribution as well. They have worked with us to distribute some of our books, so we really appreciate that as well. So delighted to have them in here this evening. They did a fantastic job putting together a tour of the exhibition, relating it back to Lizzie's book, Daughters of the New Year, which I just think is pretty amazing when we can have programming that really brings the exhibition to life in that way. So I hope you all had a chance to walk through and experience that, talk with the volunteers. Thank them very much for their participation in the program and getting ready for tonight. I think it was really great. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers for tonight really quickly. Right, all the way to the left here, we have Dr. Megan Holt, who I'm sure many of y'all know, Executive Director, One Book, One New Orleans, and the Words and Music Literary Festival. We have, Next, we have Lizzie Tran, who is a Vietnamese American writer from New Orleans and is the author of the Book of the Hour, the Book of the Year, Daughters of the New Year. Who is our senior historian at HNOC and the curator of Making It Home from Vietnam to New Orleans. It says here, well, he is our oral historian, and somebody here, whoever wrote my notes for me, also said, and he likes cats. All right, I will turn it over to them. Thank y'all very much.
Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping things. Number one, you'll see in some of the slides, it says photograph by Megan Holt. Megan Holt is not taking credit for any photographs in the exhibit. When it says photograph by me, it means for the purposes of that slideshow only. So just a clarifying note there. So I'm giving credit where credit is due, and it's not here. And secondly, this is a novel. It's got a plot. I tend not to do spoilers. So I might say a character does something, and I will allude to it, but I don't want to give it away because it really makes me angry when people spoil my books for me. So I'm not going to do that to you good people tonight. And those are the two housekeeping notes I have. So now we're just going to get into the connections between Daughters of the New Year by Ian Tran and Making It Home from Vietnam to New Orleans. And I'm going to start at the most obvious place, and that'd be slide 3, please. All right, so in this book, there is a trophy. It figures prominently in many scenes. There's a quote from one of those scenes on the screen right now. That trophy is not a fictional trophy. That trophy is a real trophy that sat in Lizzie's house for years. And if you walked by the kitchen of the exhibit, that trophy is in the kitchen of this exhibit. So I was wondering, Lizzie, if you could tell us a little bit about how that trophy really sparked this book, like we talked about in the afterword. And then Mark, if you could talk about its inclusion in the exhibit.
Sure. Yeah, so that trophy is, it has been in our home for as long as I can remember. And I always stared at it when I played piano, because, my parents made me play an instrument. Like the stereotypical immigrant parents that they are. And so I used to stare at it because it was on top of our piano, and I would stare at it so that I wouldn't have to look at the keys. And so it was kind of this like really prominent object in my memory growing up. And it wasn't until I went to graduate school and at Ohio University, actually, which Mark and I are both proud alums. I took a nonfiction creative writing workshop, and we had to write an essay about an object essay. And an object essay, you choose an object and you kind of write around it, and you kind of explore your personal history through that object or larger histories through that object. There's a variety of ways to do it. But I picked the trophy thinking that it was an interesting object from my past. And it wasn't until I started trying to write the essay that I realized I knew nothing about it. And it's just shocking. I literally had nothing to write about. The only thing that I could write about was that I knew that the trophy existed and that it had been in my mom's life and it had been in our house. But I didn't know where it was from, I didn't know how it got there, I didn't know what the pageant was like, I didn't know what my mom's experience in the pageant was like. I had never asked her, and she never talked about it. And my parents had this way of talking very circuitously around the war and around their experiences with being displaced. They didn't talk about it, and when I asked about it, they were very evasive. And I think it was because it was very painful for them to talk about it. Even the good times, even, winning a pageant, maybe that's a positive memory, but it still, I think, reminded my mother of a past that she couldn't access anymore or revisit. And so it was just, beyond learning about my own family, I learned a lot about myself from this trophy, and that I had this realization that I had been very self-centered in our family structure. I had centered myself in everything. I hadn't asked them about this. I hadn't probed deeper. I was trying to write this essay for myself about this trophy that I knew nothing about. And that was shocking to me. It was this realization that I had. So it was this kind of turning moment for me, writing this essay. And when I embarked on writing the novel, it was a very seductive object for me to think about in the motivations of the characters, just because in the book, it's not the exact trophy that is in real life. And actually, I make some notable changes around the pageant and the trophy, but more that I was interested in the idea of an object traveling or not traveling across an ocean, and the kind of myth or the lack of knowledge that may surround that object and be recreated in a family, or not talked about at all, right? It might be this kind of absence. So, the characters, the mom character, Swan, she is grappling with this trophy in her own personal history, and then the girls are also grappling with, her daughters are grappling with, or not really thinking about the trophy at all, in the same way that is reflected in my own personal life. So, it was an entryway to talk about, how we travel with memories or how we erase them, and how objects are a very important way to record things that might otherwise be forgotten.
This exhibit, or the idea for the exhibit, started in 2015, and we were doing an analysis of our holdings, which we do from time to time, and we realized we had really nothing in the Vietnamese community. So we reached out to Vietnam, and we conducted a series of 25 life stories with their senior citizens. And so the exhibition is built on those narratives. I started maybe 2019, a little later, interviewing people that we included in Generation 1.5, people that were children at the time of the diaspora, or second generation people. I had heard about Elizabeth's work, and so I reached out to her and had a wonderful interview, and she told me the story about the trophy. And I thought it was a great symbol of the transmission to memory, which is an important part of this, and the reluctance to share stories from generation to generation. Perhaps the result of trauma, or this being uprooted from the place where they're from, and the painfulness of looking back on their own story, and perhaps wanting to protect their children from that. So I really wanted the trophy as this sort of symbol of transmission of memory from one generation to another. And we placed it in a kitchen at as kind of places where stories are told. And we thought maybe this is the time, the 50th anniversary, that older generation opens up about their past and shares that with their children. And I think the trophy is a beautiful symbol of that.
I'm so glad that you started talking about how this exhibit is built on narrative, because one of the coolest parts of the exhibit, and maybe any exhibit I've ever seen bar none, is the kitchen table. If you guys haven't had a chance yet, go back in there and press the buttons on the kitchen table and you'll hear some of these oral histories speaking to you. It's incredible to hear it from the person's own mouth as opposed to reading about it on the wall. So I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about how you got the idea for the table. And the really cool thing too is that they have put pictures of the folks whose voices are coming out. So what you see on the screen is actually the picture that accompanies Lizzie's voice coming out of the table. So talk a little bit about the table and then talk a little bit about this interview that you guys did together.
The kitchen table, we've got a great design team, and our designer Cecilia, that was her idea to have this kitchen table and also the living room as places where people could sit down and listen to the stories, which is one of the challenges in an exhibition. In the past, we've had them on the wall with little iPads, but people are standing and they don't really have the desire to stand there and listen for 3 or 4 minutes to something. And so we wanted to get people seated and then have the patients to listen to 5 or 6 3-minute pieces, which is a chunk of time. And so the kitchen table was ideal for that, and also just that idea that throughout the city right now, grandparents are telling their grandchildren and their children what they went through.
Yeah, I think our interview was very interesting because I had never been interviewed like that for the purposes of an exhibit. I've been interviewed before for radio shows or for podcasts, but I think that's slightly different because a lot of times when you're listening to the radio, you consume that and then you never revisit it. It just disappears kind of into it's a moment thing, right? It's kind of like the newspaper, like you don't really revisit the newspaper, it's just for that day. So it was really nerve-wracking to go into the interview with you because as someone who crafts narrative, even if it's in, a nonfiction essay, there is something very intentional about the perspective and the control that you have. Even when I'm writing something that's nonfiction, there's still a persona that is being put on display there. I'm still making choices about what facts to include or how to phrase something. So there's a lot of control. Maybe all writers have control issues, I don't know. And they're just like, they're getting it out. That's why we can writers. But it was an entirely different experience to have someone ask you questions and to have to answer on the spot. And then to know that what I said would be put into context in a way that was out of my control, that you were putting it in the exhibit, that I had no idea it was going to be in this dinner table. I had no idea that it was going to be placed next to or between these other stories or paired with a picture. And all of those things affect the way that someone consumes a story. And, of course, a lot of the process is just having to trust people to do it. And it also helps when you do actually trust the curator. So that's helpful. But yeah, it was something, it was an entirely different experience. I just kind of had to let go of the control of the narrative and and also to accept that, when I'm writing an essay or a novel or whatever, I'm centering a specific story. But in this case, I was part of a tapestry. I was part of a kind of a larger collection or community of stories. So that was also really, really a different way to present it. And I found it very interesting and also very satisfying to walk through it that way.
And I think that you guys bring up the importance of telling a story and telling it well and telling it responsibly, because as we all know, if you take someone's narrative and you distort it or you do something irresponsible with it, a lot of anger can be evoked. And I think we see this on the wall when we see the protests of the 1983 PBS documentary about the Vietnam War. And I'm wondering, Mark, if you can tell us a little bit about that documentary and why folks were so incredibly ticked off about it, because I knew nothing about this documentary until I saw a reference to it on the wall.
There's been a narrative that the Vietnamese community really came into its own politically after Katrina, and that they were just very quiet and didn't say or do anything politically before that, but that wasn't true. And in Mark Simler's photographs, who's back there, he took many photos in the exhibition when he documented the community from 1978 to 85, and we were fortunate enough to acquire his photographic collection, which is over 15,000 photographic negatives, and so we're still digesting that. But this reaction to the PBS documentary, I think, reflects the nature of that older generation, that they came out of the war where they were fighting for their country. They saw the documentary as being too sympathetic to the communist forces that took the country and who they were fighting against, who they were fighting alongside with American soldiers to defend. And so it just hit a nerve in the community. So they had a really significant protest in City Park, and then they marched to the WIES building and had protested there.
And where I think we see the similar anger, study 11, please. In the book is when a character has to do a report on Vietnam. And she comes to school with information she's gotten from an encyclopedia set from 1986, just 3 years after this documentary is released. And the information about Vietnam is not great. And one of the things that makes people really mad when they see this is the representation of the Vietnamese flag, because she puts the North Vietnamese flag in her presentation. And her fellow classmates get really angry about that. And I think it was that same anger, that same hurt that you're talking about when the documentary from PBS was released. You're reflecting that in the book with her classmates' reaction to the flag. You all see that reaction, there's a quote on the screen. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about sort of that palpable anger toward this character's presentation that you feel in the book. And then I'm going to ask you a follow-up question.
Yeah, so that is based on an experience I had as a kid, actually, when back in the day when we did research using encyclopedias. And I remember, I think maybe it was in middle school that we had to do a presentation, and I had, I used an encyclopedia, probably outdated because you only buy one set, and unless you're rich. And the encyclopedia had one small section on Vietnam, and it had, some stats about rice farming, and then it had the Vietnam flag that is used today in Vietnam. And so I put that in a presentation, and while the character in the book is derided for this publicly by many of the other students, that actually doesn't happen to me. What happened to me in real life was that another young Vietnamese American student whose childhood immigrants as well, he looked at my project and he said, "Why would you include that in your project?" And I was like, "I got it from the encyclopedia, He was like, what are you, a communist?" And I was maybe 12. I didn't even know what that was. And we didn't meet, my parents didn't talk about it. We didn't have the relationship where I could ask my parents for help with the project. I didn't show them the project, I just brought it. And so that was a moment for me where that was my first interaction with, this boy, of course, didn't live through the Vietnam War, but he has taken on the kind of he's inherited the anger that his parents have. And it was my first interaction with that kind of intense emotional connection to symbols that I didn't realize was, you know, we have this reaction all the time, like the connection that people have to the Confederate flag. It's like very intense. The way people react to monuments being taken down, very intense. And so this was my first experience with that as a young girl. And, you know, it makes sense. These flags, you know, maybe it doesn't mean something to this particular generation, but for my mom and my dad, you know, I think that they would have been very upset to know that I had included that flag in the presentation. And it's a matter of perspective, right? Like I was talking about this with someone, I just came back from Vietnam, and I was kind of glad that my mom didn't come with me for this particular trip because it was the 80-year anniversary for the North of becoming independent and expelling the French colonists. And in April, that's in September 2nd, I think, was the 80th anniversary. And then in April was the 50th anniversary of in Vietnam, they say it's the reunification. But if you ask someone in the US what they would call it, they wouldn't necessarily call it reunification. They would mark that moment in time differently. And so, you know, going there to Vietnam during this time of celebration, there were flags everywhere. There were, you know, the Vietnam flag, and then there was also the sickle and the hammer flag. They were everywhere. Like every street was adorned. There was just a level of nationalism and patriotism that was very unexpected. And I just thought about how, you know, how different experiences are when you move from place to place, and you think about generationally how this would have been, you know, how this is different for all these people who live here, these young people who have grown up with a certain idea of what this flag means, and then what this means to my mother if I had brought her here. I feel sure she would have been upset by the bombardment of imagery. And so I think it's just, you know, she associates that with her displacement, she associates that with suffering, with you know, loss, and I can't really fault her for that, right? And so part of the book was just exploring that kind of disconnect that for me as the next generation who was very disconnected from my culture, we didn't talk about it, I had no feelings attached to it. I didn't know. Versus the kind of intense feelings of, you know, loathing and probably disgust. I might even say disgust, like that she might feel, or that a different generation might feel, depending on your experiences. So, yeah, I mean, it's just, I always remind myself it's a matter of perspective. If you ask one person one thing, they'll say something. If you ask another person another thing, they'll say something completely different.
Yes, follow-up question. So, when I was walking through the exhibit, I saw the flag that your character Xuan and Tien and her family would have been under when they were living in Vietnam. And it was the first time I had ever seen one of those flags in real life. I'd seen pictures of them before, but never one in real life. And I think for a lot of us in this room, that might have been the first time we'd actually seen an actual South Vietnamese flag. So I was wondering if you could tell us the story about that particular flag and how it came to be in this exhibit.
One of the people that we interviewed was Kim Do, and he was Chief of Operations, or Deputy Chief of Operations for the South Vietnamese Navy. And he orchestrated the evacuation of over 30,000 South Vietnamese soldiers and their families as Saigon was falling. And there was a ceremony at sea. He said that his men felt defeated, they had just lost their country, and so he asked the American admiral they could hold a solemn ceremony at sea where they took down the South Vietnamese flag and raised the American flag, and that flag was presented to Kim Do, and he donated it to another museum, the Naval Heritage Museum, and they let us have it for the exhibition. You know, part of the ceremony was the fact that the Philippines didn't recognize South Vietnam as a country and wouldn't allow the ships into the port unless they were flying the other American flag. So that was the actual reason for it, but they did have a solemn ceremony to help the So,
So that flag is in the adrift section of the exhibit. There are 4 sections. Adrift kind of tells the story of getting from one place to the other. And the other thing that is in that exhibit, that part that really moved me, is the living room. And can slide 10, please. We found the Pham Vu family. It's the story of one family and their journey from Vietnam and making their home to New Orleans, and now the kids have kids, so there's now 3 generations here. And what really resonated with me was not only the family pictures on the wall of that living room. I mean, I think all of us have a picture from the 1970s and 80s in front of a car with their parents somewhere. But also just this idea that you're going to take one family and tell their particular story. And you did that beautifully in the exhibit, and you did that beautifully in this book. So I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about why the one family narrative was so compelling to you.
well, all of these stories were so traumatic that it seemed too much. And we wanted to give the visitor a sense through the story of one family of what these diaspora stories were like. And I met Na Quinlan, who's sitting right here. And I did an interview similar to what I did with Lizzie about her life here. She's that part of that generation 1.5 who was a small child at the time of the diaspora. And so we did an interview with her, which was great. And she invited me to do an interview with her mother up in Baton Rouge. And so I had a wonderful time, and had translated for me. And she told her story. I also had a chance at another meeting to interview 2 of Na's siblings, and they had, which is unusual for refugees, they had a lot of photographs of the family, both back in Vietnam during the diaspora, and then their life here in New Orleans East. And so that was very attractive. And they also, years later, discovered themselves on television. They were watching documentary about rescuing during the Vietnam diaspora, and they saw themselves in the video. And the German ship that had picked them up was doing a documentary film about their work, and it just so happened to be the exact time that they were picked up. So you see them being lifted from the boat that they were on, brought onto the ship, and then the rest of their documentation takes them through the refugee camp in Singapore, arrival here in New Orleans, and their life growing up in the East. So it was just a natural fit. We didn't have that for any other families.
I think that the family, focusing on the family unit was, I think it's great that it does it in the exhibit, because I think Vietnamese families are so family focused. I mean, maybe that's a generalization, but most Vietnamese families that I've met have a huge emphasis on, taking care of the family, making sure the family unit is taken care of. And so for me, for writing this book, I wanted to focus on the family, partially because I wanted to emphasize that culturally, but also, to me, the interesting part of the survival of a family is that, or just any individual person, you're here today because someone before you survived. Someone was able to give birth, raise you, and the person before that was able to do that, and the person before that, and the person before that. And so there's this lineage of people who have, despite all odds, because there's a lot of stuff trying to kill us, like every day. It's actually amazing that we've survived. But there's a lineage of people who, so far back beyond anything that we can remember or record, has survived so that you are alive today. And so I was really interested in focusing on the lineage of the family. Because even though that lineage is so long, we forget within generations who those people are. Like, it's very rare that you would ask someone if they could name their great-grandmother, or their great-great-grandmother, or their great-great-great-grandmother. And so I was interested in reversing that. The book goes in reverse order, so I wanted to kind of put that on its head, subvert it, and we end up kind of forgetting the people in the beginning and focusing as we go backwards on those people in the past that we typically forget or are erased by time and memory.
I forgot to notice that having the living room was one of the best things in the exhibition. Na brought her family a number of times to the exhibit. I remember one time her mom was sitting in the chair and she had all of her grandchildren sitting in front of her. It was just such a sweet moment. And then I also organized a family reunion where we had branches of the family that ended up in Europe, and they came for the first time to see the family here. I think maybe 43 people for the family reunion who all got to tour the exhibition together, and they got to share their stories of the past 50 years.
So, Mark, you've used the term Generation 1.5 a couple times during this conversation. Slide 3, please. I'm sorry, slide 4. Slide 4 really sort of touches on this identity issue I think you're talking about with Generation 1.5. 3 of the 6 voices coming out of the table mentioned this idea that they sort of felt trapped in between. I think you said you have one foot in one world and one in another. You all see the quotes from the other speakers who shared that sentiment. They're on the screen. And then in the book, the line I can quote verbatim is Trapp realized she had a hybrid identity, right? So I'm wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about that sort of struggle for where do I fit in? Who am I? Both in your book and in the interviews you did.
Okay. Who talks first? Yeah, I think that this is very common in not just the Vietnamese community, but I think in any immigrant narrative, you can find this kind of liminal conflict where it's like you have a character who comes from one culture and is removed and placed in a new culture, and there's always going to be a struggle between, what does your identity look like? It always feels like you have to choose, right? Like, am I Vietnamese or am I American? And the reality is that you're both, of course, and that there's no way to avoid being both, but it always feels like it's in conflict somehow. And I certainly felt that way growing up. Like I had to, if I was choosing one thing, that I was forsaking the expectations of my parents in some way or another. And so that kind of struggle or those feelings of misunderstanding, that I wasn't understood by the world, that of course was poured into the book. I mean, I think all of those characters feel like in some way or another, like they have to compromise one part of their identity to fit in or be accepted in the other part. And I think more often than not, because you want to be accepted by, mainstream American society, you feel like you have to muffle or, smother the other parts of your life because you feel ashamed of it. Maybe your lunch smells bad, or maybe you feel dumb wearing your cultural outfit at school, or, there are all kinds of dumb things that don't really matter in the long run, but matter so much when you're growing up. I really wanted to tap into that feeling of adolescence, of being young and really, really caring. Because it doesn't matter, but it does in the end. Those small hurts or those cruelties that you experience from other people do make a difference in how you grow up.
I think Lindsay's interview is really great at speaking to issues of identity, and she talks a lot about that in her interview. Another person is Cindy Wynn. Her interview is fascinating, and her decision to legally change her name to Cindy, spelled like Cyndi Lauper, is because she was such a big fan. I think really speaks to that sort of transition. But I've been finding like it's really difficult. One of the big challenges to the exhibit were dealing with those issues. And I think people, even regardless of generation, are at different stages of identity. And we found that particularly with the names, which was one of the big challenges of the exhibition, is to get people's name right. some people, like Na's brother, just wanted to be Danny. Other people didn't care about diacritical marks in their names, where some people wanted their names to be presented in the traditional Vietnamese way, in the order different than we have it here. And sometimes that didn't have anything to do with age. I just assumed that the older interviewees would care the most about having their names presented in the traditional Vietnamese way, but that wasn't the case. I think with some of the younger people, there's a resurgence in being proud of being Vietnamese and wanting to bring back that traditional. And so it was very mixed up, but identity was certainly an issue in how we presented this, and one of the big challenges.
So this is not a spoiler, but one of the things that Lizzie does really well around naming that I thought was so beautiful, but it took me 4 times reading your book to see it. When the characters Swan and Tien immigrate from Vietnam to New Orleans, they lose the accent marks in their names. So when they're in Vietnam, they have the accent marks, and when they're in New Orleans, they don't. I thought that was really beautifully done to sort of mark that transition. The name in the exhibit, though, that almost made me hit the ceiling, and I had to go 3 times to see it, was Quong on the soldier's uniform. The dad's name is on the soldier's uniform in the exhibit. And I'm like, I know that wasn't planned, but that's such a great coincidence that one of the characters in the book is also one of the soldiers who loaned their uniform to this exhibit. It was a really neat coincidence and an intersection. So I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about his story. That is the last slide. That would be slide 14.
He was a soldier in the South Vietnamese army, and his brother is the uniform on the far side, and he was a helicopter pilot, medical helicopter pilot for the South Vietnamese army as well. And he told his story, his older brother did, where he, as Saigon was following, he loaded his helicopter up with his family, dropped them off. They jumped off onto a U.S. naval ship, and then he, by himself, crashed the helicopter into the ocean and then swam to the boat, and was wearing the uniform that you see in the exhibition. His brother, Quang, was shot in the face in an operation and was in the hospital for a long time, and then was sent to a re-education camp. And so he told the story of the re-education camp. And he wasn't able to join his brother here in New Orleans until the 1990s. So the fascinating stories, they both participated in an event that we had here about a month ago, where they kind of told their stories about the war.
So one of the things that you just mentioned was that he was sent to a re-education camp, and in the book you mentioned that as well. And I found that really fascinating. It was one line where you just said this character's brother is over there being re-educated. But what I found fascinating about that was after listening to you talk a couple times, you said, I never really knew about Vietnamese history growing up. We weren't taught. I know as someone educated in U.S. public schools, I was not taught Vietnamese history. I didn't know that the French colonized Vietnam for a long time. And so I'm wondering, thinking about the historical context of this book, when you sort of started delving into that history and what you were surprised to learn. If we want to see that a little bit, it is on slide 12.
I started really researching it during my doctoral studies. I did like a English hybrid degree where I did a creative dissertation, but I also did like doctoral research in an area of study. And so my area of study was Asian American literature, and so it's very cross-disciplinary, and you end up reading a bunch of things about, lots of other things. You end up reading lots. You end up reading so much that you want to die. So I was doing a lot of research on the Vietnam War and And then when I started researching the book, I also was looking at a lot of like primary source material, like newspaper clippings and watching, news stories and things like that, and finding archives online. So I was just that was when I really got very deep into the research of Vietnamese history. And it's funny, my actual intro to it though was when I was at Ohio. They have a very good Asian studies department in Ohio University for some reason. And so I took a class, it was Introduction to Southeast Asia from the Beginning, was literally the name of the course. And it was an insane course because it was like, the beginning of what time? Like, and it was also like, Southeast Asia is so diverse, like there's so many countries in Southeast Asia. The teacher, the professor was like, this is gonna be like a quick skim of Southeast Asia. So that was like kind of my intro, and I had this realization, like, if I wanna learn about Vietnam specifically, then I have to seek it out myself because, it's not, the institutions aren't built to teach me about this. But as far as like re-education camps and things like that, like while my family didn't really talk about it, it was always like those terms and those ideas were somehow present in our family mythology somehow. Like they weren't talking to me about it, but like if you asked 16-year-old me if I knew what a re-education camp was, I would say yes. And I couldn't tell you how I knew, but I just knew because there was, it had permeated our family history somehow and our family memory. So I had this kind of like very superficial knowledge about it.
So it is 6:43. I'm going to open it up for questions after one more question, which will maybe be very short for Mark to answer. It could be yes or no, I'm not sure. So while I ask him this question, y'all be thinking of yours. And for those of you who are clustered in the back, I am short, so I might not see your hand. You may have to stand up and wave if you have one. All right, so Mark, things fall apart. I want to know if it's a William Butler Yeats reference.
It is. Yes. Yeah. And so I was just trying that first part of the exhibit for me was so difficult to do because there was so much, from the partitioned country to Vietnam War, and there was so much stuff. Jana Lippman, who's a professor at Tulane University, really helped me kind of forge the languages. It was so hard to be as brief as you need to be for exhibition text and still be correct. But I wanted to have a title that kind of reflected the feeling of each section of the exhibition, and it was their role falling apart in a very real way.
Thank you so much for indulging my nerdy question. Okay, do any of you have nerdy questions you'd like to ask?
Good afternoon. And I want to applaud the Story of the Women's Collection for putting this exhibit on. I'm going to ask a question. A lot of people they come up with comments before they ask a question. But I am going to ask you a question. The first question is, what are you working on next? And the other question is, are you familiar with the book? There's two books on Vietnam that I found totally fascinating. A Bright Shining Light, John Paul Mann, and also The Fire in the Lake. And my other comment is that the United States missed an opportunity with Ho Chi Minh back in the 30s with Woodrow Wilson, because he had approached the United States about helping them overthrow or getting rid of the French colonialist reign. This exhibit is totally fascinating. As a retired letter carrier, I delivered mail out in New Orleans East by Versailles, and I grew up in San Antonio as a military brat. And I saw a ton of Vietnamese, everyone who come through San Antonio and learn language skills. There's some things in here that totally resonate with me, but my question is, what are you working on next?
Oh, what a difficult question for me to answer, because they say that the second book is the hardest, and I'm definitely feeling that that's true. But I was working on a book about sorority women, and then I know, quite the whiplash, huh? I was writing a book about sorority women, and it's gone through like several different iterations, but I decided to kind of step away from that, and I started writing something new, and it is from the perspective of the father in this book, and it's kind of like a take on Don Quixote. It's kind of like, you know, this very Quixotic adventure that he takes during the war. So yeah, I'm not very far into it, but that's what I'm working on right now.
So Quixote is one of my favorite books. I'm going to go ahead and call dibs on your author interview. Dibs, it's mine. Questions?
Yes, I think that this shows how little we teach about worldwide cultures in our schools and our books. People assume, and I'm talking at the college level, at the grade school level, the junior high level, we do not teach the children about each other. We do not teach about all the many different people who wound up in America for many different reasons, who are not all related, and do not share the same culture, history, heritage, genetics, or identity. And I think I wanted to know, everybody ask yourself the question, why do they not teach about all the many different people that wound up in America?
Absolutely, and I think this would actually be a great time for Mark to tell us a little bit about HNOC's education programs for kids to fill in those gaps.
Yeah, we have a great education department, and they're always reaching out to the schools and doing things. And I think we discovered that in ourselves when we took a hard look at what we collected about 10 years ago. And I think that's really changed, and to really think about what's coming into our museum and how it represents the community as a whole. And I think we did that really well with this exhibition. The exhibition upstairs, the Trailer Glaze, also came out of that same time period where we realized we didn't have anything on the African American Civil Rights Movement. And so we've really built a strong collection. We've got plans to reach out to the Honduran community and do something similar to what we've done with the Vietnamese population here. So we're thinking that way. And I think the more documentation we can build in our museum and our archive will feed educational programs in the school in these different areas. So I think things are getting better.
Other questions? Lisa.
This question is actually from Elise, who unfortunately had to leave early. Lizzie, she wanted to know what feedback and reaction have you gotten to your book from the Vietnamese community, and what stories do you feel need to still be told here in New Orleans?
For here in New Orleans?
Or larger. Yeah.
Well, thankfully everyone's been really nice to me about anyone who doesn't like it hasn't told me, so if you don't like it, then stay away. I don't know. But I mean, you know, other Vietnamese Americans or Vietnamese people who have read it that they've connected with it have told me that you know, they saw themselves in it, or that they recognize some of the feelings or the emotions in it. And that actually, honestly, when people come to me and tell me that, it makes me feel so good, because they were the audience that I was imagining. Because growing up, I never had any books that I felt I was represented in. I mean, I think maybe the closest was like Joy Luck Club. And I read that. I didn't even read that in high school. I read that when I got to college and did like a ethnic literature class or something like that. So I was writing for like, you know, the version of me who never got to read that growing up. So it feels really good when people tell me that they recognize themselves in it, that they recognize those emotions and those experiences. But at the same time, I also know that, and I don't at all claim that what I've written should stand in for like the broader, you know, it's not, I'm not saying it's the quintessential experience. I'm not saying that it's every Vietnamese girl has experienced this, or that, you know, I think the issue is that when there are so few examples of the literature, that people tend to put a lot of pressure on it. Like when Joy Luck Club came out, people were like, well, this isn't every Chinese person's experience. Well, it's not supposed to be. We need more books about Chinese American experience. And so I think that more people should write about, you know, about what they want to write about. So there's so much more that I couldn't even possibly imagine because I didn't experience it or know about it. And I'm also writing from an incredible place of privilege. You know, my family had, I had the ability to go to writing school. Even people don't necessarily do that unless they have a certain amount of privilege. And, I had the ability to take the time to write this. And so I think that there's a lot of people who don't look like me, who don't have my privilege, who don't have my economic background, who should probably also write books.
I did not know a lot about Vietnamese history before reading this book. And one of the things that I'm really grateful about spending this year with the One Book, One New Orleans program is the chance to explore it in a lot of different and really beautiful ways. And I have learned and grown from this experience of reading and reading closely and reading in community. And I think that that's what good books and good literature do, right? They inspire empathy and connection to people who might not be like us. So yes, I absolutely agree with the person's point back there that this is what should be done, because this is how we're going to create those senses of connection with not just people who look and sound and speak like us, but with our larger community. Questions, comments, concerns? We've got 5 minutes left officially until the book's signing.
One other comment, and I want to piggyback on what the young lady just said. It's not so much incumbent upon the school system or the educational system to expose people to various different aspects of American culture, because this country is like a, for lack of a better word, a blanket with a bunch of different threads in it. And I don't know if that makes any sense to you. But the emphasis should not be placed upon the school system because they have their own agenda. Our agenda as an individual should be able to expose our children, our culture, and our people around us to various parts of what makes America America. This is not a perfect country, it's a very imperfect country. But I always tell people there's 2 cities in the United States. One is Piedras Negras, which is on the Rio Grande River, and the other city is Eagle Pass. And in Piedras Negras, there's a line, it was a line prior to Trump. There was a line 3 miles long and 4 miles wide. In Piedras Negras and Eagle Pass, there is no line. And here's the analogy and the metaphor. Piedras Negras and Eagle Pass on the opposite sides of the Rio Grande River, which is Texas. So I'm looking forward to getting your autographed book. and I'm going to be honest with you, I'm going to try and read it before the end of the year. I have what they call the stack of shame. There's a ton of books that I got to go through, but there's so much. This is my second time coming to hear you and Megan. Thank you, Megan, for the one book. You know I love you very dearly. I'm a voracious reader, and I'm very cognizant of the fact that it takes all of us collectively to be engaged in and make this country. One other thing, Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy recognized back in the 50s that the United States should never get involved with a land war in Asia. Google that because it's always now at our fingertips. And I'm not going to make any comment one way or another on what happened in Vietnam. Because if they would listen to Ho Chi Minh, they could avoid having a whole bunch of people get killed unnecessarily. Thank you very much.
So Stan, it's not a stack of shame, it's an emotional support stack. So, I too have heard nothing but good things about this book except for one critique. And that is that folks wish they had gotten more of a certain character. I want to learn more about that person. I wish I'd known this. I wish I'd known that about this person. So we're going to do a little something in October to try and fill that in. We're going to have a fan fiction workshop. So if you've read this book and you want to write a piece of a character's story that you didn't get to read, stay tuned to our website and our socials, and you can find out more info about the fan fiction workshop and come write your own chapter of Daughters of the New Year. Until then, hang out with Lizzie in the back. She'll sign your book and talk to you about all the things you didn't get to ask right here. I want to give it up to Amanda McFarland for having coffee with me in 2021, because that's when our partnership started. We're going to give it up to Lloyd Boyer, who has been the boots on the ground at HNOC. If anything happened tonight, it's because she did it. Thank you, Lord. We have volunteers back here tonight. Thank you guys so much for showing up and giving your time, talent, and energy to One Book One New Orleans. Mark and Lizzie, thank you again, and thank you all for coming.